Hey, welcome back to 316, a Bible study of Bridgeway Church out of the Tampa, Florida area. My name is Joel Eason. I serve as the senior pastor at Bridgeway, and I'm super excited that you're with me for this particular study. For our regulars, it's always great to have you, and for anybody who might be new with us, it's a joy for us to connect with you. I just want to bring you up to speed in case you're unfamiliar with it, why we call this 316. We anchored years ago when we started doing these into 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16, reminding us that all scripture is God-breathed and it is useful, and it's useful for a host of things like teaching, rebuking, correcting, training in righteousness, in order that we might be thoroughly equipped for what God has called us to do. And so we like to go, when we can, verse by verse through these studies. And if you're new with us, we'd love to have you look back through our catalog. We've gone through all the Gospels. We've gone through all Paul's letters. We've gone through the book of Acts before. This is actually our second time coming through it. I don't think that you'll find the first version of going through Acts on our YouTube channel, but we like to go verse by verse where we can through these. We've even touched the Old Testament prophets, both the major prophets and the minor prophets, and so hopefully these studies are advantageous for you in your particular personal studies. Now, tonight we find ourselves in the book of Acts, and we're at the very end. We've been going through this for some time, all through the beginning of 2025, and we find ourselves into the last two installments of our study. And for this particular lesson that we're going to go through, we are going to have to paraphrase quite a bit. And the reason is, instead of taking on just one chapter, we're going to be taking on chapter 21 through 26. So chapter 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, and 26. So there's going to be portions that we look at verse by verse, and then there's going to be other portions that I just paraphrase what's happening there, so that we can go through the whole time. I'm trying to capture the trial of Paul in one setting. And if you were to call it 2 or 3 lessons for this, you would find that a lot of the defense, a lot of what is said, is reiterated. What might be said in chapter 23 might be reiterated again in chapter 24, maybe just slightly different. So I think it's suitable for us to take the totality of this particular trial. Now, let me show you where we've been. The Apostle Paul, obviously, we've gone through all the book of Acts, but his first journey was chapter 13 through 14. His second journey was chapter 16 into 19, involving Galatia and into Ephesus. His third trip was chapter 19 through 20, where he goes through Galatia to Ephesus, and it focuses primarily on Ephesus. Whereas chapter 13 and 14 focused on Cyprus, and then the 4 places in Antioch, or in Galatia, Antioch of Pisidia, Iconium, Lystra, Derbe, and then he cycles back. In chapter 16, he really focuses within Philippi. There's some other towns that are identified. In chapter 17, you had in Macedonia, you had Thessalonica, and then Berea. And then he's going to come down into Athens. In chapter 18, we see Corinth. In chapter 19, we see Ephesus. Back at chapter 20, he had cycled back into Macedonia and then retraces, because there was a plot on his life to cause him harm. And so he, instead of coming across the Aegean Sea, he goes back up through Macedonia. We won't go back through all that. But in chapter 21, at the very beginning, he has pulled himself away from the Ephesian leaders. They've wept through the night, they've prayed, and his journey has taken him all the way to Syria, Caesarea, and now he's down in Jerusalem. And he's going to be arrested in Jerusalem. We're going to watch the arrest. We're going to watch the trial that follows. So let me show you a summary. In chapter 21, he's going to arrive in Jerusalem. He's going to get arrested at the temple. When he arrives in Jerusalem, he'll meet with James and the other leaders of the church in Jerusalem. But then he's going to get arrested at the temple, and he will end up addressing the crowd. It's a very hostile crowd. In chapter 22, we'll find that he is going to give his defense. He's going to defend his Jewish qualifications and his Roman citizenship, and he will be before the Sanhedrin. We'll talk a little bit about that as we get there. Chapter 23, a plot's going to develop to have him murdered. And so there will be a secret plan to transfer him to Caesarea. I'll explain a little bit of why Caesarea. And then you'll see in chapter 24, 25, 26, 3 different trials, 3 different defenses, one to Felix, one to Festus, and then to King Agrippa. We'll talk a little bit about each of these guys as well. And that whole process from chapter 24 to 26 is going to take over 2 years. And so this is a big chunk of time for him, one that does not happen quickly. So then the way the book of Acts will finish is chapter 27. He will depart for Rome. They'll begin to sail to Rome. They'll end up shipwrecked after they come through Crete, and that takes us from chapter 27 into chapter 28. They'll be on a little island called Malta, and then from there they'll sail to Rome, and we'll talk about that next week. But chapter 21, let's go ahead and start working through it. It says, when we arrived at Jerusalem, the brothers received us warmly the next day. So this is happening quickly. They get there, they get situated. There's hugs, there's the, hey, in the morning, let's chat, kind of conversation. Paul and the rest of us went to see James. James is the half-brother of Jesus, who is often considered as the lead in the church in Jerusalem. He's going to be the one who authors the book of James. So he goes to see James, and all the elders were present. We know that there was a leadership cluster, so to say, in Jerusalem. We see that back in Acts 15 with the decision upon Gentiles and Gentiles being saved. We see that in Acts chapter 11, where Peter is explaining what the Lord is doing amongst, this was up in Caesarea. And so we see that there is a leadership base there in Jerusalem. So we'll continue. Paul greeted them and reported in detail what God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. Now, I love what happens next. It's very practical. When they heard this, they praised God. So there is an excitement about what God is doing, but there's also a caution about what is present. So it's possible to be very excited for somebody. Somebody has a testimony, look what the Lord has done, and it's like, that's awesome. Okay, there also needs to be some thoughts around something. Let's say, for instance, somebody needs a financial miracle and they receive a financial miracle, and you're high five, celebrate. But then there's also the practical conversation. Okay, what got you into the situation where you needed the miracle? And how can we go about maybe solving the scenario where we don't put ourselves in that kind of a pinch? Same thing on like somebody's very unhealthy in their diet. Somebody's very unhealthy in their physical practices. And maybe God does a miracle in healing them of something. And you're like, praise the Lord, fantastic. Now let's also talk about the practical. Maybe you need to change some things in your diet. You need to maybe not get in a situation where you're desperate. It's that celebration and practical that we see here when it says they heard this, they praised God. Then they said to Paul, you see, brother, how many thousands of Jews have believed, and all of them are zealous for the law. They have been informed that you teach all the Jews who live here among the Gentiles to turn away from Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or live according to our customs. What shall we do? They will certainly hear that you have come. Now pause here. Let me just remind you of something that tells us in Acts chapter 20, verse 16, that Paul is trying to get to Jerusalem by Pentecost. So we're going to assume that he was successful with that. If we rewind the tape all the way to trip number 3, in trip number 3, Acts chapter 19 and 20, he was hoping to get back to Jerusalem for the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So just as a reminder, in the spring, the Jewish feasts are Passover. The very next day, you have the beginning of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So Passover is one day. And then following that, you have 7 days, which is considered, that 7-day window is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So for many, they frame Passover as an 8-day celebration. Passover, 7 days of Feast of Unleavened Bread. The next one that you're going to see is going to be Pentecost, which is going to be 50 days later. So according to Acts 19, he wanted to get there for the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which had been Passover. He doesn't make it. Acts chapter 20, verse 16 tells us he was hoping to get there by Pentecost. And so we're assuming that he has gotten there at a time when Jerusalem is full of pilgrim travelers, people who have traveled to Jerusalem for the Pentecost celebration. For the Jewish community, it was Shavuot, and in the Greek wording of Shavuot, you would get Pentecost, so meaning 50. And we won't re-explore that. If you want more details on what that feast is, go back to our study of Acts chapter 2, because it is we explain that deeply as to why the unfolding of the tongues and the fire upon people. But this is Jerusalem's full. Jerusalem's full at this time. And James and the brothers are saying, listen, there are a lot of Jews here who, when it says here underlined, many thousands of Jews who have believed that Jesus is the Messiah. There's a revival that's happening. However, all of them are zealous for the law. They haven't abandoned their Jewishness. They haven't abandoned the Mosaic law. So they are ascribing that Jesus is the Messiah. However, they have a very strong grip upon all that they've ever known in the Mosaic law and their Jewish customs. And it sounds to them, or the rumor to them is, you're saying that that's of nothing, which is untrue. But Paul's going to recognize the necessity of peace, not defending strongly, but going to be choosing peace. So what follows the verses here is there's going to be an agreement between James and the leaders with Paul and his traveling companions to go to the temple to present themselves for purification. That's according to the law of Moses. And then there's going to be this 7-day period. So that's where we're picking up then in verse 27, when the 7 days were nearly over. So this time of purification was nearly over. Some of the Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple. They stirred up the whole crowd and seized him, shouting, "Men of Israel, help us. This is the man who teaches all men everywhere against our people and our law and this place," being the temple, saying they are suggesting Paul says this place, the temple, our law and our people are nothing. And he prioritizes the Gentile over the Jew. And besides, he has brought Greeks or Gentiles into the temple area and defiled this holy place. That's not going to be accurate. It's what they're going to accuse. So just because you have accusation doesn't mean it's accurate. I mean, how many times have you experienced it or watched it in our culture or watched it with a friend that you have accusation does not mean it's accurate. But often people will get in hysterics around accusations, not accuracy. And so what's going to happen here is people are going to get very riled up by the accusation against Paul, and then Paul will have to defend himself. Now, I'm going to show you a photo in just a little bit as to the Temple Mount, and where this probably is taking place. But their logic and their reasoning was verse 29. They had previously seen, this is a name, Trophimus, the Ephesian, in the city with Paul. So Trophimus was a Gentile from Ephesus, and they're like, oh, we saw him in Jerusalem, and there's an assumption that Paul brought them into the temple area. The whole city was aroused and the people came running from all directions. Now, I'm going to show you something here. So this is the Antonia fortress, and this is, or the Temple Mount. Let me say that this is the Temple Mount. This is a recreation, and this is a small model. If you were to go to Jerusalem, there's this area that you can see a small model format of the entire area of Jerusalem, and there's a depiction of what the Temple Mount would have looked like in the temple. And so inside of those, you see those yellow bars, that inside of that would have been what was considered to be the temple. Inside of all the walls, that was considered the temple, but also considered the Temple Mount. So inside of, you see in the back, these columns, you would have Solomon's colonnades. You've probably come across that at some time, and Solomon's porch. Well, on the outside of those gold, I've put those gold bars there. They don't, those really aren't there. I've just put them as a line. On the outside, a Gentile could be in that area. So let me lean on something that you've heard me talk about before if you've been with us in the study. For Gentiles, there was the phrase of a God-fearer, fearing, God-fearing Greeks or God-fearing Gentiles. This is a Gentile who believes in Jehovah God, one God, not many gods, and wants to follow the God of Israel, wants to follow God of monotheism, one God, and adheres to the teachings of the Mosaic Law, adheres to the worship of the Lord, but hasn't gone to the full extent of circumcision. So a God-fear that gets identified in numerous places in the New Testament would at times come to the temple, would make the journey also for worship. But they weren't allowed inside of where those yellow bars would be. There was an area that would be as close as they could get. The Gentiles were allowed in these particular quarters, but they couldn't come on the inside. The accusation against Paul is that he's brought Trophimus into that temple area inside those yellow bars, okay? There's going to be a big riot. Paul is going to be pulled out of that temple area that's inside the yellow bars. He's going to be pulled out. There's going to be a mob that's developing. And then you see the Antonia fortress. So that Antonia fortress was built later as a tribute to Mark Antony. And it is the location that soldiers would reside. And there is let's call it a prison, a jail inside the Antonia fortress. And so it is inside of there that Paul would have been brought. So it is most likely that what we're about to read, Paul is taken over to the Antonia fortress. So let me hop back to our particular look here now. So let's keep reading. And it says, he at once took some soldiers. So the commander is going to see that there's this kind of riot that's breaking out, and he at once took some officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd, most likely coming from the Antonia fortress. When the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. The commander came up and arrested him, being Paul, and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Now, they're going to arrest him. Paul's going to be seized, and then they're going to take him to the barracks, which would have been the Antonia fortress. As the soldiers were about to take Paul into the barracks, he asked the commander, "May I say something to you. And verse 39, Paul answered, I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia. And we explored that already with Paul back when we explored Acts chapter 9 and his conversion. We looked at where he was from. We talked about his history. We're going to see him mention his history a couple times, and I'll lean more into different aspects of it. But he says, I am a Jew, not I'm a Gentile. I'm a Jew. From Tarsus in Cilicia, citizen of no ordinary city, please let me speak to the people. Having received the commander's permission, Paul stood on the steps and motioned to the crowd. So he's down the steps of the Antonia fortress there at the Temple Mount. When they were all silent, he said to them in Aramaic. That's an important line because the Jews spoke in that area, they spoke in Aramaic. So we're familiar with the Old Testament's written in Hebrew and the New Testament written primarily in Greek, and we have an appreciation for that. But Aramaic was the spoken language. And so when he is speaking in Aramaic, he is speaking in the language of the people to which they'd been, So if you went to, if you had, let's call it somebody under accusation and that you thought was maybe a foreigner, and they began to speak in perfect English, you'd be like, wait a minute, that sounds the same way I speak. He speaks in the same dialect, he speaks in the same language as the people. And so that's going to garner their attention. And he's going to speak about his testimony. Now, keep in mind, he has defended his testimony in a number of different places, and now it's going to happen at Jerusalem. He really hasn't had to do this yet. He has had to defend himself in various parts of the Gentile world. He's had to defend himself to the apostles in closed quarter meetings after his conversion. Now he's on the Temple Mount, and he is going to give a defense of his name and his story in Acts chapter 22. And Paul said, I am a Jew born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city. I was brought up here in Jerusalem under Gamaliel. I was thoroughly trained in the law of our fathers and was just as zealous for God as any of you are today. So let me lean on that. So Cilicia, as we've talked about, is north up by Syria, a little beyond Syria. It was a place that was occupied under the Roman Empire. We'll talk about his citizenship in a little bit when we get to his statement. But he was transferred to Jerusalem for training under Gamaliel. So let me just lean into what we know, and I'm pulling from other verses. We know that Paul is or was a Pharisee. We know that he was trained and had a reputation and a seated place, so to say, amongst prominent Pharisees. He will say that elsewhere. Gamaliel was one of the high bars of teachers of the Mosaic Law in Jerusalem. Paul is saying, I studied under Gamaliel and I was brought up in Jerusalem. So nobody can challenge my Jewishness. Nobody can challenge my connection to Jerusalem, even though I'm born and raised, so to say, in Tarsus. You could say I was raised in Jerusalem. And he says, I've been zealous for God more so than any of you. And he's going to defend that. He says, I persecuted the followers of this way to their death, arresting both men and women and throwing them into prison. That is Acts chapter 6, 7, and into 8. And also the high priest and all the council can testify. I even obtained letters from them to their brothers in Damascus. That's Acts chapter 9, on why he was going there to pursue and arrest, and went there to bring these people as prisoners to Jerusalem to be punished. So everything he is saying so far is entirely verifiable, and nobody can debate it. And then he's going to give his personal testimony. About noon, as I came near Damascus, suddenly a bright light from heaven flashed around me. I fell to the ground and heard a voice say to me, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Who are you, Lord? I asked. I'm Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting, he replied. That we can read straight from Acts chapter 9, and he is saying, just as that I experienced that, I'm telling you what has happened. He has explained this before, but he is defending his story. Then the Lord said to me, go, I will send you far away to the Gentiles. And watch the reaction. Everybody was fine so far with, you were a Jew, born in Tarsus, but raised here in Jerusalem under Gamaliel, and you persecuted the way, even though, you know, the audience is like, many of us are followers of the way, kind of, but we still hold the Mosaic law. And all of it was good until you said, I'll send you away to the Gentiles. And then verse 22, the crowd listened to Paul until he said this. Then they raised their voices and shouted, rid the earth, he's not fit to live. And you have just this like tipping point where they just are assured that everything that he has been accused of for his abandonment of Jewishness to being a Gentile and the favoring of Gentiles, and it's like that line, I will send you far away to the Gentiles, they interpret as all of the accusations about him against Jews and Gentiles is accurate. So they call for his death. Well, what ends up happening is the commander is going to take him, to flog him, to satisfy the crowd, but Paul's going to say something. As they stretched him out to flog him, Paul said to the centurion standing there, is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty? When the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and reported, what are you going to do? He asked, this man is a Roman citizen. So let's lean on that for a second. So a Roman citizen had rights that others didn't, because this is all Roman Empire. At the time of this, Jerusalem, Israel, it's all under the Roman rule. And a Roman citizen, despite where they were, despite the location they were found in, they had a set of rights that superseded local law, that superseded local common ways of handling things. A Roman citizen who had citizenship, and to be in the Roman Empire, not many people had Roman citizenship. You were in the Roman Empire, but it did not mean you were a Roman citizen. It is like the exclusive titanium card from Visa or Discover or MasterCard or, American Express. It's like the highest level. Not everybody, other people might have, a Visa card, but not everybody has the titanium level. Roman citizenship was at the highest level. And you could not punish a Roman citizen without a Roman court authorizing it. So just because you have Roman guards doesn't mean that they can persecute or flog a Roman citizen. They have to have gone through Roman court. So you have here where the commander and the military guy are like, what do we do here? So the commander went to Paul. Tell me, are you a Roman citizen? Yes, I am, he answered. Then the commander said, I had to pay a big price for my citizenship. So not everybody has it. Not even the Roman commander. And it says, Paul says, but I was born a citizen. Now, there's a lot of speculation as to how that came about. There were different parts and different times that Roman citizenship could be deeded to somebody from somebody who had, call it, land and Roman citizenship. So there's speculation. I'm just giving you speculation. Paul's father had to have had some measure of Jerusalem influence for him to be able to have his son come train under Gamaliel. Impossible for that not to be the case. Paul's father had to have Jerusalem ties. And the assumption is that his father in Tarsus in Cilicia most likely was there not as a Roman citizen, but was deeded in some way, whether it be by serving over a period of time, whether it be by some form of hospitality from somebody he worked for or under, but somehow he was deeded Roman citizenship in Tarsus, and Paul was born into that. Because there's no way for him to have the two ties to Roman citizenship out of Tarsus in Cilicia and have access to Gamaliel and within Jerusalem. So that had to have come from within his father. But continuing on here, those who were about to question him withdrew immediately. The commander himself was alarmed when he realized that he put Paul, Roman citizen, in chains. And so there's a what do we do with him now, and that's what sets up chapter 23. So in chapter 23, Paul is going to stand before the Sanhedrin, who were the ruling council there in Jerusalem as far as of the temple area. And they were constituted primarily of Sadducees and Pharisees. We'll talk about them. And it says, then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and other Pharisees of the Sanhedrin, called out in the Sanhedrin, my brothers, I'm a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. His dad was a Pharisee. And his dad is the one that gave him access or the opportunity to study under Gamaliel, even though he had gained his Roman citizenship up in Tarsus of Cilicia. I stand on trial because of my hope in the resurrection of the dead. Now, let me just lean into this before you see it. The Sadducees that you see there on the screen, Sadducees did not believe in resurrection or eternal life. They believed in just tangible life. They believed in the practicality of the law of Moses and the necessity of the law of Moses. But they rejected the prophets. They rejected eternal life. They rejected all of those kinds of things. It was basically, we think that the law of Moses is essential for how we operate within civil and community life. The Pharisees absolutely believed in eternal life and resurrection and the afterlife and all of those things. So Paul's statement here is really interesting when he says, I stand on trial because of my hope in the resurrection of the dead. And that's not entirely true. He stands on trial because of what they were accusing him of abdicating against the Jews for the Gentiles. But Paul is real savvy in what he says here. Because in a roundabout way, it is his hope in the resurrection of the dead, but it is his calling to the Gentiles that triggered all of this. But he knows that this will cause a dispute. So watch what happens. When he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. Instead of them talking about Paul, they start bickering at one another about whether there's a resurrection or there's no resurrection. The Sadducees say there's no resurrection and that there are neither angels nor spirits, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. So he is real savvy in saying something that turns them on one another. What happens in verse 9 through 11 is there's going to be, because they're making no progress against Paul, there's going to be a plot to take Paul's life. And so it says, the next morning, the Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. So there's this, okay, we're going to get nowhere with the Sadducees and the Pharisees. We're going to get nowhere with the Roman soldiers because they're not going to do anything against him. He's a Roman citizen. So if you're sitting there, let's put you as a neutral bystander, but you wanted Paul dead. And you wanted Paul to suffer, and you wanted Paul to, his message and his influence to Jews and Gentiles to stop. You're not going to get the Roman soldiers to do anything if he's a Roman citizen. No chance, because he has the rights of a Roman court. You're not going to get the Sadducees and the Pharisees to be in agreement now because of what he's just said. So that's why there's the development of a conspiracy for us to have him, no longer in the picture. We have to kill him. Well, what's going to end up happening is this plot is going to be unfolded, so to say, and there's going to be a decision to transfer him to a town about 70 miles away called Caesarea. We'll talk about that in a second. Then he called two of his centurions and ordered them. So the Roman soldier, Roman commander who's in charge, hears about this plot, and he says, get ready a detachment of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at 9 tonight. Provide mounts for Paul so that he may be taken safely to Governor Felix. So let me explain that. Caesarea is about 70 miles away. It's a town that was, if you were to travel there today, we've been there twice with our team when we travel to Israel. It's called Caesarea Maritima, and it is a city that was dedicated to Caesar, and that's why you get the name Caesarea. And it was a very prominent place for Roman soldiers and establishments. Crews, so to say, ships would come into Caesarea, big port, and you would have many, I'm trying to find the right word, not battalions, but let's just call it troops, establishment of troops that would come into Caesarea and then would be dispersed up towards Syria or down into Jerusalem. This was a port that was very active with people coming into that area. So within that, the reason that there are so many people, 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, 200 spearmen, is to have the appearance, not of we're smuggling Paul out, but have the appearance of a military movement. Like if you were in Jerusalem and you saw this many Roman soldiers fashioning together, you would think there's a military campaign that's being prepared. They're going to Caesarea for some form of assignment. You wouldn't be looking for Paul in the midst of this. So the quantity of soldiers here is not about protection of Paul. It's about the disguise of Paul. So they're going to go up there, and the governor in that area, his name is Felix. So this trial that's going to go on from chapter 24, 25, and 26 is going to cover more than 2 years. You'll see that here in just a second. So in Acts 24, he's going to be up in Caesarea now. The plot against his life has ended because there's no way you're going to be able to pull off a coup in Caesarea with the Roman soldier presence there. So it's going to have to happen by trial. So it says in Acts chapter 24, they brought their charges against Paul before the governor. When Paul was called in, Tertullus, who was basically the lawyer, so to say, against Paul, presented his case before Felix. We've enjoyed a long period of peace under you. We found this man to be a troublemaker, stirring up riots among the Jews all over the world. The Jews joined in the accusation, asserting that these things were true. Now, please keep in mind to get Roman sentencing against a person, the best method to try and get a Roman punishment against somebody was to call them into the threat of the peace of the area. Remember, we go back to Jerusalem, and this is not the accusation against Paul. The accusation against Paul was that he was violating the law and that he wasn't fit for living because of what he was doing to the Mosaic law with the Gentiles. Here, the Roman jurisdiction would say, what do we care about your law? You're just a small populace. So they have to try and show that he is a danger to the peace of Rome. What happens with Jesus? Think about the trial of Jesus. The Sanhedrin meet in the course of the night, and they call him into blasphemy. Are you the Son of God? Jesus says, it is as you say. They rip their robes. We've heard enough. They go to Pilate, and what do they say to Pilate? They that he's making claims of divinity, they go to Pilate and say, he's stirring up trouble. He has created treason, and he's a danger to the peace of the area. So that's exactly what they do with Paul here, same kind of thing. Well, Paul's going to get the chance to give his defense, and I'm going to just show you an abbreviated version of what he says. And Felix is acquainted with the way, or Christians, the church, and I'll lean on that in a little bit. And Paul will give his defense, and then Felix is going to order Centurion to keep Paul under guard, but to give him some freedom and permit his friends to take care of his needs. And he's going to say, when I find it convenient, I'll send for you. He was hoping that Paul would offer him a bribe. You're going to see that in verse 26. So you can just look at kind of the paraphrasing of these things. Now, think about it for a second. Why that component? I'm going to show you one more verse in just a second, but why that component? Felix knowing of the way, the church, being gracious to them, and not feeling that this is an alarm. Well, let's keep in mind what's happened in Caesarea earlier in the book of Acts. We know that in chapter 8, that a guy by the name of Philip the evangelist, has come into there, and there has been a revival that's happened in Caesarea, and Peter came to acknowledge it. Peter came to see it. And then you're going to have, over in chapter 11, you're going to have Cornelius, who the Bible tells us was of the Roman soldier system, Italian regiment, and that he was a centurion. He's a leader over 100 soldiers there in Caesarea. And that becomes incredibly favorable. Cornelius and his whole family get saved. So the roots of the church in Caesarea has been real peaceful, been real gracious. And even in Acts chapter 18, when Paul comes back in from his second trip, he comes to Caesarea. He greets all those in the church. It's most likely that Felix knew about Paul and knew about this church is no danger. This church is not, they came in, what you saw in verses 2 through 5, or 2 through 9, they came through saying that these are troublemakers creating all kinds of riots and everything. And Felix would have been like, no, that has not been what we've watched here in Caesarea. These people are of no danger. And so there's a real grace here. At the same time, Felix is hoping that Paul and the church will try and bribe him. Now watch this, verse 27. When 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus. So this is in limbo for 2 years. So when you look at Acts chapter 24, you have a package up in Caesarea where it's real docile. And Paul has permissions to have visitors and bring stuff for his needs, food and clothing and parchment so he can write and different things. And this goes on for 2 years. In Acts chapter 25, we're going to see that now that Felix has been succeeded, Festus is the new leader. Verses 1 through 9 is going to sound a lot like what had transpired earlier, where there's going to be back and forth on things, but Festus is going to want to get rid of Paul, and so he's going to agree to a plot against Paul, in which Paul's going to have to now call for, to preserve his life, he's going to have to call for being tried in Rome. So it says, Paul answered, I am now standing before Caesar's court where I ought to be tried. I have not done any wrong to the Jews. I appeal to Caesar. That is code for, I want my trial to go to Rome. After Festus had conferred with his council, he declared, you've appealed to Caesar you'll go. So, great. If you're Festus, you're like, great. You're out of our hands. Get him on a boat and send him to Rome. Because let him take care of it there. Based on his Roman citizenship, he had the right to call for his trial to happen in a Roman court context. Verse 13, a few days later, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea to pay their respects to Festus. Since they were spending many days there, Festus discussed Paul's case with the king. Now let me lean on this. Where you have King Agrippa. So you would have governors in an area, and then you would have a king over the larger area. King Agrippa is more famous than Festus. He's more famous than Felix. He's more famous than Pontius Pilate in the story with Jesus. And the reason is, if you've heard of Herod the Great, King Herod, the one who was in charge when Jesus was born and has all these babies in Bethlehem and surrounding areas murdered, who followed Herod the Great when he died, were his sons. And he has 4 prominent sons, and 2 of them become the most prolific in Scripture. You have Herod Antipas and Herod Philip. And you know the story of John the Baptist, and he calls out, against this marriage. And the reason is Herod Antipas took the wife of his brother, Herod Philip, and he married her. And that marriage, which was completely immoral, is what John the Baptist speaks against. Now, the reason I'm saying of this Herod Philip and Herod Antipas, well, if you follow the Herod family line down one more step, then you come to Herod Agrippa, who will be in succession of uncles. And Herod Agrippa, all within the family of King Herod, is the one who is the king of that area. So it's not so much that King Agrippa is prominent just in his own name. He is prominent in the family that he's within. So he is of the family of Herod. And so it's going to continue on. Verse 22, then Agrippa said to Festus, I'd like to hear this man myself. He replied, tomorrow you'll hear him, is what Festus says. And what ends up happening is in verse 23 through 27, there's going to be formal presentations of a trial, sitting king. Anytime a king would come, there's going to be regal formalities. There's going to be an explanation of the trial. All of that happens in verse 23 through 27. Finally, it's going to come to Paul getting to speak. It says, then Agrippa said to Paul, you have permission to speak for yourself. So Paul motioned with his hand and began his defense. And in verse 1 through 23, he's going to retell his life story and testimony and his calling. So once again, we could go verse by verse through that, but it'll sound just like what has been happening in chapter 22 and what he's had to defend in other places. So read it, but you'll say that this seems repetitive, but it's repetitive over this more than 2-year window to different audiences. But let me just pick up. It says in verse 20, first to those in Damascus, then to those in Jerusalem and in all Judea, and to the Gentiles also. He's talking about who he spread the message to. I preach that they should repent and turn to God and prove their repentance by their deeds. That is why the Jews seized me in the temple courts and tried to kill me. They tried to kill me because of not disturbing peace. They tried to kill me because I'm preaching the gospel to the Gentiles. And then he's going to lean into Agrippa, who ruled that area. Like about the prophets. Once again, if I lean into Agrippa is of the family of Herod. Well, his brothers, Herod Antipas and Herod Philip, had to deal with John the Baptist. They had to deal with Herod the Great, had to deal with the prophets who Micah said in the prophet Micah, we read about from Bethlehem, basically will come this Messiah. And Herod has a fear of that. That the Old Testament prophets and then in the development of the Gospels, it impacted the Herod family. So this is real interesting that Paul says, King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know you do. Like this has impacted your family. And then Agrippa said to Paul, "Do you think that in such a short time you can persuade me to become a Christian, to be a Christian?" And verse 29, Paul replied, "Short time or longer, I pray that God not only you, but all who are listening to me today may become what I am, except for these chains." So he basically turns from looking just at King Agrippa and says, "To all that are here, I pray that you would have a response to what I'm talking about." Well, it's going to come to a close with that, basically. The king rose, and with him the governor of Bernice and those sitting with him. They left the room, and while talking with one another, they said, "This man is not doing anything that deserves death or imprisonment, so he is not a threat to the peace of Rome. He is not a threat to the peace in Caesarea. He is not a threat to the peace in Jerusalem. He is not a troublemaker or a riot maker, so everything that is being accused of him is inaccurate. However, this man has said, 'I appeal to Caesar.' And because he said, 'I appeal to Caesar,' that means he needs to be sent to Rome." Agrippa said to Festus, "This man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar." So, because of his words of "I appeal to Caesar," and that was a statement of "I want to be tried in a court system in Rome," then you are going to have to go to Rome. And so what happens in the book of Acts is chapter 27 and 28. Paul will then be on a ship, set sail for Rome. They will encounter a huge storm. There's going to be a shipwreck that happens just off the southwest portion of Crete. They will find themselves drifting and shipwrecked onto the land of Malta. And then from Malta, over a period of time, they will then be able to set sail after weather has cleared. They will set sail once again on a different ship to Rome, and they will land within Italy and make their way into Rome, and he will be in custody. And with that, the book of Acts will come to a close. So that's what we're going to look at next time together in chapter 27 and 28. We'll be looking at Paul's journey to Rome and how it all plays out. So that is chapter 21 through 26 in a summary. Certainly, if we had loads and loads of time, we'd be able to go verse by verse through a lot more and just kind of take our time. But I wanted to give you a general view of it. Hopefully, you'll take time to read all those chapters and just kind of digest it all. But I just want to just say one thing before I let you go. So Paul, from chapter 21 to 26, it happens over a period of more than 2 years. We have that very famous verse where it says, "From Felix to Festus," that this was carried out over 2 years. Sometimes you can be in a situation in which it's taken so long, and you're like, "I need this to pick up speed. I need this to move along faster. Lord, why is it taking so long?" The timing of the Lord is different than what we anticipate in most contexts. The timing of the Lord is always perfect, whether we understand it or not. And so as we go through whatever it is that the Lord has for us, whether there be delays or whether there be accelerations, let us not resist what God has for us, and let us not get jaded against the timing of the Lord. Imagine had Paul gotten jaded because of the 2-year delay, had he just become cantankerous, and then in front of Festus or in front of Agrippa, maybe he could have said things and done things that would have jeopardized not only his future, but jeopardized the gospel just because he resisted the timing of the Lord. I want to encourage you, whatever you're going through, to be gracious and gentle and loving and worshipful in the midst of the timing that you're going through, because the Lord makes no mistakes, not only with people and locations and events, but also with his timing. May the Lord bless you in his timing, and may the Lord gain glory from everything he does in your life. I hope to see you in the next study.